Well, Russia is on the move again. This time, the apparent target is Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, and the implications of the offensive range from a simple sleight-of-hand operation to the biggest escalation of the war since the initial invasion. So, today, let's take a closer look at what is going on here. We will start with the facts on the ground near Kharkiv, before pivoting to trying to understand why it is happening now. A clear part of the story is Russia's closing window of opportunity, which we will revisit. But we will also examine whether Russia intends to take Kharkiv now, or whether the true strategy here is to distract Ukraine away from ongoing offensives elsewhere, or if this is a more basic exercise to push Ukraine further from hitting targets inside of Russia. But we begin with the basic situation. Prior to May 9th, we had a front line that looked basically like this. On that day, though, Russian soldiers spilled over the border northeast of Kharkiv. The Russian plan was to primarily advance along two salients, and indeed, there were immediate territorial gains. Now, the reason for this is a little bit weird. For the last 2 years, we have grown accustomed to thinking about the war as only occurring along an eastern front, with everything in the west out of play. That is, we tend to think of the front line as looking like this. But, of course, Ukraine and Russia also share a traditional international border, and so too do Ukraine and Russia's best friend, Belarus. Since Russia's initial 2022 thrust ended, these battle spaces have been inactive. Neither side has committed serious troops to the area, because, if they did, they would immediately be the target of opposing fire. Welcome to the era of the quadcopter and cheap, round-the-clock surveillance capability. Now, contrary to some reports, it was not as if Ukraine had left the Kharkiv region without any defensive fortifications. In fact, these are photos from Zelensky touring one such set of fortifications in April. But it was known that this was an area of vulnerability. That is because Ukraine was forced to build those entrenchments fairly deep into the country, both because of the aforementioned surveillance capacity, and due to glide bombs that Russia was dropping from way behind its side of the border. The open, unguarded area thus became known as the Gray Zone. In turn, this roughly 3-kilometer wide strip of land was always ripe for the taking, pending Russian willingness to bear the cost to occupy it. And, apparently, May 9th was the day to begin that process. The question for us is why? Undoubtedly, part of the story is Russia's closing window of opportunity. We have discussed this incentive before, so I will keep this section short and focus on the latest updates here. With $61 billion of Congress-approved U.S. aid on its way to assist Ukraine, Russia is feeling a time pressure. We can already see this with the uptick in Ukrainian artillery expenditure, particularly with ATACMS. Prior to the aid, Ukraine had some unknown stockpile of the rockets. Now, when quantity constrained, you have to be conservative with your output. Say that there are this many missiles in your inventory. You do not want to be in a situation where you burn through the lot on middling targets, and then suddenly find yourself 1 week later with a golden opportunity that you cannot exploit because your shelves are empty. But when you know that more missiles are on the way, you can afford to be more aggressive, even before the first shipments arrive. And while some of that stuff has already made it to Ukraine, the bulk will still take more time. All told, Ukraine is feeling a little better, but not as good as it will be in, say, a couple of months. In turn, Russia has a window of opportunity to fight under the current conditions. Even if Russia anticipates that U.S. aid will be insufficient to get Ukraine on the offensive, and instead will be just enough to secure the underground rock scene in Kyiv, Russia still prefers fighting against less metal than more metal. The tank metal, not the Blinken metal. So if war planners in Moscow had some clever strategy in Kharkiv, and apparently they think that they do, now is the time to set it in motion. And with Ukraine removing from command the general in the region, it seems that Russia found a weak point that went above and beyond the simple gray zone gap. But what is that clever plan? Well, there are three leading theories at the moment. First is the obvious choice that Russia is actually trying to capture Kharkiv. Virtually all of the recent military focus has been on Ukraine's four eastern oblasts, but Russia has still made various claims about the next set of oblasts, of which Kharkiv would be the crown jewel. From this perspective, what we are witnessing is simply a renewal of one of February 2022's many offensives. For the first 5 weeks of the war, Russia was simultaneously trying to capture Kyiv, push out of Crimea, take control of the Donbass, and also occupy Kharkiv. And all of this was being done under the guise of the special military operation announced here, with a correspondingly small deployment of soldiers. By early April, Russia had realized that capturing Kyiv was not feasible under such conditions, and thus its troops withdrew from that theater. Meanwhile, the siege at Kharkiv continued through May, until it became clear that it was equally unsustainable. Russia pulled back, but continued artillery barrages for months. Kharkiv's full respite did not actually come until Ukraine's September counteroffensive, which pushed Russia out of the oblast almost entirely. From this perspective, Russia's current push is just a renewal of its initial strategy. But now Russia has more reasonable deployment numbers, first from the formal conscription of November 2022, and then in the time since with market-rate recruitment contracts, and thus something that was once infeasible may very well be feasible. The second perspective is that this is a fixing operation. In our last update on the front lines, we examined Russia's recent gains west of Avdiivka, its attempt to take Chasiv Yar, and the silliness of the Western media narrative that Russia was rushing for a major military victory before May 9th's Victory Day festivities celebrating the end of World War II. In case there was any doubt about this last assessment, the fact that Russia waited until May 9th to even start its play in Kharkiv tells us everything that we need to know. Anyway, Russia has made a little more progress along the Avdiivka salient. Looking at the map, this has been less along the bulge and more along the lagging parts. But the key is that Ukraine's failed rotation did not lead to a follow-on collapse. Meanwhile, there is still some slightly positive news for Ukraine a bit further north. Defending troops in Chasiv Yar have remained stubborn, only ceding minimal ground over the last 2 weeks. That may change, of course, but as of now, this is where we stand. The result is a still slow Russian offensive, which, over the last 6 months, has captured important cities, but not dramatically shifted eastward the lines on maps. Note the very small scale. Moreover, it continues to trail Ukraine's most recent offensive in terms of total territorial gains, at least thus far. Emphasis on that once more. The whole play on Kharkiv may therefore just be an attempt to get the ball rolling further south. It is a standard sort of feint, with the goal of diverting Ukrainian troops and fixing them in a different location. By Russia filling the former gray zone, Ukraine must now commit troops to the region to protect Kharkiv. That leaves fewer Ukrainians to defend Chasiv Yar and the Avdiivka salient. Indeed, there are indications that Russia is also amassing troops near Sumy, which may force Ukraine to further redeploy its troops, and then a repeat of this process. Zooming out, it is interesting how we are experiencing a role reversal from 20 months ago. Back then, Ukraine successfully used Kherson as a fixing operation to force Russian troops to commit to the south, which then led a wide-open door in Kharkiv, and, in turn, the expulsion of Russian troops back to Luhansk. The trick for Kyiv was that Russia, at the time, simply did not have enough warm bodies or the mobility to defend both. However, the aforementioned recruitment measures from the Kremlin now appear to give Russia the manpower advantage. You can see this with Ukraine now turning to prisoner soldiers, which comes with most of the problems that Russia experienced back when the situation was flipped. And while Kyiv has taken further measures to bolster conscription numbers, it will still be months before we see the effects of that. That note aside, the argument for this faint interpretation of Russia's actions is again manpower. Kharkiv may be a major prize, but administering it would be a giant headache. Russia thought that it would find a sympathetic public there at the beginning of the invasion. To wit, it was where Viktor Yanukovych initially fled when the 2014 revolution began, before he eventually left the country. Moreover, the vast majority of Kharkiv's inhabitants spoke Russian as their first language. But that intelligence assessment was wrong, and any latent support evaporated as Russia shelled the city. To narrow down the population problem, Kharkiv had 1.4 million inhabitants before the invasion, with the metro area extending it to 1.7 million. The war, of course, displaced some of those people westward. But by early 2023, at least 1 million had returned, and many accounts indicate that the population has reverted to something normal. If the city were to not disband as Russia approaches now, a 100 citizen to 1 soldier ratio would mean that Russia would need 17,000 bodies to administer the area, never mind how many thousands more to entrench themselves along a front line that starts to take an ugly left turn. Is that something that the Kremlin is interested in doing? Maybe. But right now, Russia's deployment to the region is insufficient for such a task. Again, at least for right now. In contrast, taking the high ground in Chasiv Yar and then using it to push Ukraine out of the remainder of Donetsk sounds like an easier task for Russia to handle first. Another piece of the puzzle is that Russia is destroying bridges to the east, which is generally not what you want to do when your aim is to unite two fronts. It is, however, a good idea when you want to freeze the opposing army's movement. In fact, hitting road infrastructure with HIMARS launches was a major part of Ukraine's strategy back in September 2022. Of course, let's not forget how defensive allocations actually work. Russia may intend this as a feint, but depending on how Ukraine responds, Moscow may ultimately see Kharkiv as the more promising place to focus its efforts. Remember, when everything is publicly observed, all of these effects tend to cancel each other out. What matters is the private information, so it is virtually impossible for observers like us to predict what will happen. Even if Russia does not intend to make it into the city, the more modest goal of establishing a foothold in the region comes with 2 benefits, aside from fixing Ukrainian troops. First, if Russia can push from 30 kilometers away to under 20 kilometers, Kharkiv starts to fall into tube artillery range. That means that Russia can inflict a steady stream of damage on the city, without wasting expensive rocket artillery. The Kharkiv region is Ukraine's 3rd most economically productive, generating 8.3 billion euros in value per year prior to the war. Consequently, paralyzing the city will cause a recession in an already vulnerable economy. And second, on a more basic level, occupying the gray area will make it more difficult for Ukraine-sponsored Russian partisans to conduct cross-border raids, which have been happening intermittently for almost a year. Combine this with the economic incentive, and you basically have a buffer zone with benefits. As for which of the 3 possibilities it is, well, that's something that only the Kremlin knows, and they ain't telling anyone. But I can tell you how to pick up one of my books on the war. All you have to do is check the video description for more information. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.